but it was devastating. It was so painful. The separation, especially the separation from my children, devastating for my children. Like you really do burn it to the ground and have to start from the bottom and rebuild. But that is where the beauty lies because you rebuild something different. And it's not based on any of those worldly things that I had so depended on prior to going to prison. And it's still happening. The building process is still happening for my children. Um, and and that's the paradox, right? The most difficult, beautiful experience you'll ever have. So.
Hello. Hello. Good morning. This is Andrea Park.
And Alexa Dumitru.
And this is another episode of How I Escaped Prison. And today we have a special guest, Portia Louder. Thank you so much for being here with us today. And I would like you to introduce yourself and tell the listeners who you are and what you do.
Oh, well, thank you for inviting me to be with you this morning. Yeah, so my name is Portia Louder, and I live in Utah, so here in the United States. And a little bit about me. I am a mother. I guess I'd like to say that first. Married to my husband for the last 28 years, Chad. Um, Also, I'm a photographer. That's what I grew up doing. My mother and my grandfather were both photographers, and so that was kind of my gift as a child that they gave me, and I grew up doing that. That was the majority of my life before I had this big experience that changed everything, which was going to federal prison. And the way that that happened for me was I started investing in real estate. And during the 2005, 2008, when the bubble crashed, I was investigated and indicted for mortgage fraud. And at the time, I had 5 children, 2 that were out of the home married, but 3 young children at home. And it just seemed like an impossibility. Like, how could I leave my family and go to prison? What I didn't know and really couldn't anticipate was the freedom that I would find in a federal prison, right? Which is what your podcast is about. And so it was very painful. I say the hardest, most beautiful experience of my life. And I ended up, when I came home, it was about a 5-year stay for me. But when I got home, my life was completely different. My view of life was completely different and what was important to me. And I could see that my search for accomplishment and money before I went to prison just was so meaningless in comparison to the experiences I'd had. And so I came home and I started working with at-risk youth and in treatment, drug treatment, and then also with the homeless community in our state, and became a coach and a mentor. And then I got the opportunity to speak about my experiences, and I wrote a couple of books about my experiences. And then I get to meet amazing people like you, and we talk more about the beauty and the good things that can come from such a hard experience. So that's me.
Yes, thank you so much. And now we usually know our guests for a long time, and we know and we've shared experiences. But with you, um, I was looking on LinkedIn the other day, and it's so much information online. And somehow I stopped. We weren't friends on LinkedIn, but somehow the universe conspired for your profile to come into my feed. And it was one of your articles that you wrote about prison. And I stopped and I read it. And it was so beautiful and resonated so much with my experience that I sent you a message and I asked to connect. And this is how I'm in New York, you're in Utah, but we're in this great country, America,
Same
United
wavelength.
States, yes. And I'm so grateful that you do the work that you do and that you speak about it, because it's, as you said, it's incredible that we find a sort of a paradox, that we find freedom in prison.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, I say if somebody would have told me before I went to prison, you're going to go to prison and everything is going to work out in a beautiful way for you, I would have said, heck no, I'm not going to prison. I don't care how beautiful it's going to be, because to me, prison was death. Like if you go to prison, it's over for you, because first of all, only bad people go to prison. You know, that kind of notion that if you go to prison, you're just a terrible person. And then how do you recover from that? Like I couldn't imagine a life on the other side of prison. And yet I would never undo that experience, because of I really came to know myself in such a different way. And that was worth it all. But it was devastating. It was so painful. The separation, especially the separation from my children, devastating for my children. Like you really do burn it to the ground and have to start from the bottom and rebuild. But that is where the beauty lies, because you rebuild something different. And it's not based on any of those worldly things that I had so depended on prior to going to prison. And it's still happening. The building process is still happening for my children. Um, and that's the paradox, right? The most difficult, beautiful experience you'll ever have. So, yeah.
Yes, and how I say is that there are no bad people in this world. They're
Yeah.
only unconscious people. So
Right.
when we wake up from the dream, we realize what life really is, and what's the meaning of life, and that a rich life is not necessarily about money.
Right. Yeah, I was recently speaking to a youth group, and I was sharing an experience that I had in prison about and it was connection. It was kind of a fun experience that we had, where we were all competing in this little they called it the battle of the units. So all the different units would show up and they would compete in different events. And I was talking about the tenderness of the girls that I was competing with. And one girl raised her hand in my youth group and she goes, well, it sounds like there were a lot of good people in prison. And I said, there were, like some of my sweet friends, you know, that I met. And she said, then why were they in prison? And she goes, so there's good people in prison. And she goes, and I said, well, there's good and bad people everywhere, right? I said, there's good and bad people out here. And you're right about that. Bad really isn't the right adjective for that. But I would say some of the strongest, bravest people I met in prison, you know, just people overcoming such difficult lives. And once I, you know, once I could see and hear their stories and where they came from, it made perfect sense to me. Prison was actually their opportunity. I mean, how sad is that? You know, prison was an opportunity to rest from the world and some of the difficulties of their upbringing. And they were grateful. I had a lot of friends that were grateful that they could just get a GED, because they were, you know, hadn't had those opportunities. And so I just don't see anyone as good or bad. You know, I didn't see anyone in prison any different than the people I saw out here, except that they were really brave. They were braver than I was used to meeting. So,
And what's interesting, what I observed in prison is that differences between people, cultural, color, education, disappeared. And we were all the same,
that is,
regardless of, yeah, of background, regardless. We were literally all the same women, connected by suffering,
yes,
united by suffering.
that is such a beautiful explanation of it. You know, I remember when I got to prison and we're all wearing the same khaki uniform. and I'm looking around. At the time I was working in education, and I see all these people, and I thought, this isn't a prison, this is a hospital. Like, this is not, and I felt so much love. I remember this gal, but she was in her 50s and she couldn't read. And she would sit there with me and try to sound out these letters, and she would tell me how nervous she was. And if I would have saw her on the street, because she was a pretty big gal and she was tattooed up, and I would have been like intimidated. And here I am.
Yeah.
And she's so nervous, and she's like, Miss Louder, can you show me? Like, I don't know how to sound that one out. And I'm thinking, this is so different than I thought it would be. And I love the way that you described that connection that we shared, because it does. It eliminates, prison takes away all of those pretenses. We're the same. We eat in the same place. We wear the same clothes, and we are united through our suffering. Because when I got to prison, I sat there at a bench in the day room, and I cried so hard I couldn't breathe because I was missing my children. And I just sat there looking out a window crying. And a woman I didn't even know that I met sitting there looked over at me, and she goes, "It's okay, honey. Keep breathing. It will get okay. This pain will pass." And that's when I realized everyone in here knows this pain. They've all experienced this suffering. And this sweet woman who doesn't even know me is comforting me. I don't even know her name. I never found out her name, but she cared enough, because she knew the pain that I felt, to say, this will pass. Just keep breathing. You'll get through it. I don't think somebody on a subway would even do that for me. You know what I mean? Out here, I don't think anyone would reach over if I were sobbing like that and say, it's okay, you're going to get through it. Yet that's what happened over and over again for me in prison. So.
Yes. And I think in prison, we discussed about judgment 2 weeks ago with our guest. And I think judgment is what keeps us separate. That disappears in prison. And I have a chapter in my book where I describe my first night. I was at the lowest point of my life, and I thought that my life was literally over.
Yeah.
And my cellmate, my bunkie, started, first of all, she gave me everything I needed, food, clothes, everything. And then she opened up about her story. And that was the first time when I stopped and I asked myself, why is outside? I've never met people so kind. Here in prison, I don't even know this woman.
Yeah.
And she's offering me everything, especially a new perspective on life, because she said that she was grateful to be in prison because she overdosed twice and that prison saved her life.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so surprising to go to prison, and it's completely different than what the world portrays it to be. And I don't know about you, but sometimes I watch those prison movies and I get really irritated because I'm like, that's not it. Like, I'll see this big room full of people in bunks and they make it look all hardcore and scary. And I'm looking at them going, man, that's a miracle that they're living in bunks 3 deep and all they have is this little corner and they've got their towel hung up. I'm like, do you know what it takes to all live together in harmony like that? Nobody out here could do that. I'm like, that they're amazing. And everybody else is making it sound like they're these awful people. I'm like, you don't get it. It's just so backwards the way that society, and I think that society believing that has fed into the justice system, right? They can just lock people up because they think everyone there is bad and they're protecting society from those people. And that is just not true at all. There's a lot of people in prison that I would trust to watch my children and my grandchildren over the prosecutor or a judge or just normal people out here. I'm like, they had my back. They were kind and willing to sacrifice, like you say, everything. You got nothing in prison. You have a few granola bars and you're willing to give half of what you have or all of it to somebody else who's struggling. Who would do that out here? It's kind of miraculous, really. So
yes, it is. And that's the reason why we're having this podcast, to invite people like you and to show people on the outside that prison is not what society portrays, and that prison can actually be a transformer of life, and it's a new life that I'm blessed to have started to live again.
Right. Well, I think that women have a different experience than men. They have different challenges. And one of those is that the connection that we have to our children, right? That
Yeah.
connection that we have to our children breaks us in a way that some don't recover. I have learned now that the pain and suffering of hurting one's child, like for me and the women that I met there, is a whole different type of pain and suffering. And what that did to our children and what that did to us. I mean, our choices are, in my opinion, we're either broken apart and we come back together, or we're broken apart and we never make it back. And that's what it is for women and our children. Halfway through, I looked at my children and I thought, this is the fight of my life. I have to find myself here. Like this, if I don't, the result for my family will be devastating. If I don't find my way through this, my children will feel like a victim to the system. And then, they're going to end up in the system. I mean, it was like I had to really dig deep to figure out what this experience was going to mean to me, because otherwise the results were going to be catastrophic for my family. And that is what we see generations going on there, that pain of brokenness for women in prison. And then their children are broken. And a lot of them end up in the system after the fact too. So.
For me, you're right. The pain was more for her than it was for myself.
Right.
And that's the reason why we started this podcast together, because there are so many children of women in the system,
right,
that
Don't have a voice.
don't have a voice. And she's here to express her experience and how she found her way out.
Right. And I think that a lot of society likes misery, I think. And
Yeah.
people like to listen to true crime and they like to hear the bad parts, but they don't like to hear the reality of it. And they don't like to hear the perspective of people that were affected, like their kids and the spouses. And I think that's the most important demographic to hit, because
Right.
there's so many kids out there who are alone and who feel alone
And lost.
just as I did, and I would have loved to have someone out there who I could just connect with,
Right.
because it's really like it turns you 180 as a kid,
Mhm. Yeah.
so yeah.
I remember my daughter was about 16 years old, and my family was visiting, and I was far enough away that I couldn't see them very often. And I watched them grow up. Like I'd see them a year later and they were 6 inches taller because they were teenagers. And I remember my daughter looking at me and she was depressed. I could see the depression that she was carrying. And she said, "I'm so tired of this, Mom. I'm so tired of this." You know, and you're right, that aloneness. She didn't have anyone she could share those feelings with because her friends' parents weren't in prison. It wasn't something,
Yeah.
even if you grow up in a community that is maybe disadvantaged, in more poverty, and you have friends that their parents are in prison, there's still not a place to say I'm hurting. In those places, there's the bravado of, yeah, my mom's locked up, Well, my daughter didn't either. She didn't, and probably you didn't either. You didn't have anywhere to turn and say, every, when Christmas comes, I feel so alone. I just dream my mom will walk in. Like I can't, because we get limited minutes in prison, right? I mean, how many phone calls? That's the other thing. I'm like, why would they give us limited minutes? I talked to my children about once a month because I have a lot of children, and I'd be talking to my husband, and I mean, my minutes, they were just gone every month, and there's not enough minutes there to have those conversations, and it's difficult for the kids.
You had 300, right?
Mhm.
Minutes, yes. So when I was in, the pandemic hit. And when the pandemic hit, they gave us 500 minutes
Mhm.
and they were free.
Oh, wow. Well, that's a huge up.
Yes.
I mean, I had money to make phone calls, that's the difference. I had family, my siblings and parents, and even though my husband was trying to rebuild our life out here, I didn't have those concerns, and I'm super grateful for that. But 300 minutes is 4 15-minute phone calls a week. So that means 4 days a week you can make one 15-minute phone call. And I have 5 children and a husband. So I couldn't even talk to each of them one time for 15 minutes a week. Like I had to rotate that. And then my parents and my siblings. I mean, how do you stay in touch? I called I don't think I ever talked to my mom while I was in prison. I talked to my dad about once every 3 months. Like that, I wrote letters, and I'm grateful for that. But those minutes to me, especially for a mother, it was so devastating for my children. I mean, even text messages, that would have been nice to be able to just say, I love you. Today's your first day of school. I'm so excited for you to go to school today. Any of those things. It broke me like on a level that I didn't know I could be broken. Like I did not know I could break to the degree that I broke. And then I found something so fundamental about myself, like who I really was on such a fundamental level, that my life will never be the same. And for that, I'm grateful. For that, I am so grateful.
I think that's part of the punishment and part of the system. That not only do they punish you as a person, they punish your immediate family as well. Because there's no other reason why they would limit your minutes, especially with the bigger family.
Yeah.
There's no reason why they would limit your communication if it wasn't part of the punishment.
Yeah. My first 2 years in prison, it was just maddening. I mean, all of it was. I just thought, what is happening? I mean, when they sent me from California, which is 14 hours away from my family, they transferred me to Minnesota, which is, a lot further away. Like there's no way my family could even drive there. They have to fly, that's the expense, right? That as big as my family is, and my husband's trying to rebuild and live without an income that I'm providing. I mean, it was impossible for them to come more than once a year, really. And I think I got to this place, and I'm sure that you did as well, which was the only thing that I have control of in my life is my response to what they're doing. That's it. Like that is it, my response. And I got sharp at using my response, at my thoughts, at my feelings, all of those things. At the end of my sentence, I really got practice at this because I was transferred back to a camp. I did most of my time in a higher security prison, but I was transferred back to a camp in California where I did 7 months. And they called me in shortly after I got there and told me, you're going home on May 9th. And my son graduated high school at the end of May. So I was excited. I was calling my husband, the kids, everyone was ready to come pick up mom. And then on May 7th, they called me into the office and said, we're going to keep you 3 more months. And so it was going to be August 7th that I would leave. And I remember feeling physically sick because I knew there was nothing that was going to change that decision, because when you're dealing with the system, you can only break yourself against it. You're not going to change anything. That's all you can do. And I went out and I called my husband, and my husband was like, really? Really? And I was so brokenhearted. I would go over to the chapel and I would just cry and pray and say, God, you could change this. I did everything you asked me to do, I'm prepared to go home. And then I I came to that realization. This is my opportunity to really decide how I am going to respond. And I called my husband and I said, if they keep me another 10 years, I will leave happy, joyous, and free. They won't take that from me. There is no way. And I spent that last 3 months doing everything I wanted to do, connecting, reading, sitting in the sun, and enjoying every moment that I had left in that prison. And I walked out of that prison happy, joyous, and free. And that's what I learned was go ahead and throw me in an isolation cell for 10 years and I will walk out happy, joyous, and free. You cannot take that from me. But man, it is difficult. When you're watching your kids suffering, that's the kind of stuff that just breaks you apart, you know? And you can get very angry at the system, but then you give power to the system. And so for me, it's like, I am going to withdraw my power. You get nothing from me. I am going to empower myself and my thoughts and my soul. And that is what I have control over. So.
Yes. And I think, as you said, I think it's was our were our trials, all the suffering that we went through. And now looking back, it's painful, but I feel that I needed to go through that in order to learn power and how to control my mind.
Right.
Because of COVID, I was in solitary confinement in the SHU for 33 days.
Yeah.
Because of COVID. And I asked myself, why, when most of the people were leaving, were released, I was stuck in solitary confinement.
Yeah.
And those days were my way of finding the control over my mind. Because the only thing that we can control in this life is our mind. And as you said, how we respond to what's happening to us.
Mm-hmm.
And then by the way of being released, I was supposed to be released at the beginning of June 2021.
My graduation. For my graduation.
Was her graduation. And I was so happy. And then they kept pushing it, and we don't have a date. We don't know. The file kept coming back and coming back for more information. And she kept asking me, so what's happening? Are you coming home, really? Or
should I buy your ticket for the graduation? Or
and then finally, so her graduation passed. Her birthday, 18 birthday passed.
Yeah.
And I got home August 5th.
Yeah.
So 3 months later.
Yeah.
So I know exactly what you're saying.
That is when you're challenged. All the things that we learned, I did some time in the SHU as well. And all of those things that we learned, we are challenged with when we have those situations. And now I can see how that worked for my benefit, because truly, when you have that power over your mind, I think it was Anwar Sadat, who was the president of Egypt, and he I think he did close to 8 years in solitary confinement. And he said, if you cannot control the very fabric of your thought, you will never be able to change your life. And I think when you can start to shift and use your thoughts, you empower yourself. You realize, like when I look at a situation now, I think, what do I want the end game to be? I better keep my thoughts lined up with that. And it doesn't mean my emotions don't come through and they aren't very valid, that I feel this way and I have to allow those feelings to pass. But I choose my thoughts, and my thoughts override all of that. And I learned that sitting in prison, and I'm forever grateful for that, because I used to be more driven by emotion, and now I feel my emotions, but I allow my thoughts to dictate my life.
And that's yes, that's a blessing. You're right.
It is. But the casualties of that are that our children, but in some way, do you feel like also that you were empowered through the process of your mother's journey?
100%, because somehow as she was learning and growing, I was doing that in parallel, without even knowing it sometimes. And because I was so young, I was 15 when she went in. Because I was so young, I was so malleable. And now we have conversations about whatever, like normal things. And she gives me the perspective that she used to have. And I look at her and I say, I don't understand, because I have never really thought that way. And somehow I'm really blessed because I was so young and I learned so young. And I didn't have the experience of thinking the human way, you know? I'm much more advanced.
Yeah.
And I think that experience really helped me.
Thank you for saying that, because, you know, it is the most important thing as mothers that we can do. When we get our own selves right, it does bless our children. Like you said,
Absolutely.
even maybe it wasn't like you were experiencing it, but because of the connection that we share as with our children as mothers. And I think that that is exactly what every mother sitting in prison needs to hear and know. When you do this, when you face these hard things that you're facing, you are blessing your children. You know, you may not be there for that high school graduation, but because you're challenging your own weaknesses and you're moving forward and you're becoming, like you say, present and alert and aware and conscious, you are giving that to your children. Because my children have so much compassion. And it's interesting, I have older adult children that didn't experience this the same way my younger children did. And they have a different view of life. But my children that walked through this with me, they are so compassionate. They see the world from a completely, like they connect in a different way. And I'm so grateful for that, you know? So how beautiful that you and your mother experienced this awakening together. I just love that.
Absolutely. Where women, and especially their daughters, are very connected, regardless of what you do, what you want. There's no, it's like the same vein.
Yes.
We are so connected.
Yeah.
And sometimes we even get headaches at the same time. It's like, it's still going.
Well, what a
Yes.
beautiful life you guys are creating. I love that so much, and the difference that you're making. And we're all in this together, right? We're in this together. And I think the more stories that we share, the more we humanize this experience and our sisters that we left behind. We're all the same, you know? We're all the same. So
Yes. And now that we're going to reach the end of this episode, I would like to ask you, what advice or piece of wisdom would you give the listeners when they're going through tough times in life?
yeah. I think I would say you cannot see the beauty on the other side of whatever struggle you're facing. I couldn't imagine a life as beautiful as my life today. There is no way that I could imagine it. But when you face that challenge one day at a time, one moment at a time, and you keep going, there really is so much beauty. And the beauty is the journey. It's who you become in the process. And just don't give up. You can't never give up, because what I learned is in my hardest moments, something beautiful was right around the corner. And, you know, we are all connected in a very real way. We are all connected, and I'm cheering you on. You know, I think my greatest accomplishments are the things that I've overcome, probably going to prison, which sounds so silly. The thing in life that I might be most proud of is going to prison. And you don't know whether it's a divorce or mental health struggle or the loss of a child, whatever it is, how that experience will transform your soul in a way that you come to know who you are and why you're on this earth. And I just believe that in such a deep place inside myself, that our struggles are actually maybe our greatest blessings on this earth.
Absolutely. 100%.
Yeah. Thank you. And you never know, maybe something beautiful comes out of your challenge, like here, this podcast, or the main sponsor of this podcast is Alexa Dumitru Atelier, and all the clothing are made by Alexa. So out of this experience, she came out as a fashion designer, self-taught.
Yeah.
So you never know what beautiful thing can come out of your suffering. Portia, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
And we wish you best of luck in everything that you're doing in your line of work.
And we hope to keep in touch.
To
Yes.
have you back again.
I would love to do that. And I want to, like, someday I will figure out how to have you design a shirt for me or something.
I would love that.
That'd be so cool. So it's
I
wonderful.
would love that.
to spend time with you
Yeah.
guys today. And we
Thank
will
you
definitely
so
see.
much.
Thank you so much.
Right?
So if you would like to have more of How I Escaped Prison and more guests, please subscribe to our channel.
And we will have Portia's details down in the description, so check her out. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
See you next week.
Thank you.